Blood froze on Zara Miller's cheeks as she stumbled through the knee-deep snow, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping a small cloth bundle containing everything she owned in the world. The December wind of 1876 howled across the Nevada wilderness, cutting through her threadbare coat with merciless precision, as the setting sun painted the endless white landscape in shades of crimson and gold. She had been walking for hours, fleeing from the mining town of Tanapa with nothing but desperate hope pushing her forward. "Just a little further, little one," she whispered to her unborn child, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At 22, Zara hadn't imagined she'd be 8 months pregnant and trudging through a snowstorm, but fate had dealt her a cruel hand when her husband died in a mining accident 3 months prior, leaving her with nothing but mounting debts and a child on the way. The mine owner, Vernon Hollister, had made his intentions clear after Michael's death. "Pay your husband's debts or warm my bed." When he'd shown up at her door that morning with his men, declaring he was taking possession of her small cabin to cover what was owed, Zara had grabbed what little she could and fled. Better to die in the snow than live under Hollister's thumb. A contraction seized her and Zara gasped, doubling over. Too soon. It was too soon. The baby wasn't due for another month. She forced herself to keep moving, though each step became heavier than the last. The snow had started falling again, thick flakes swirling around her in a dizzying dance as darkness crept across the landscape. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Zara's knees buckled. She fell forward into the snow, the cold biting into her palms as she caught herself. Tears formed icicles on her lashes as she tried to push herself up, but her strength was fading. "Please," she whispered to the vast emptiness. "Please, someone help us." As if in answer, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. Zara lifted her head, straining to see through the growing darkness and swirling snow. A silhouette emerged, a horse and rider approaching at a steady pace. Fear and hope warred within her. What if Hollister had sent someone after her? What if this stranger meant her harm? But what choice did she have? She was about to collapse, her baby was coming, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. The rider drew nearer, and Zara could make out the broad shoulders of a man, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. He pulled his horse to a stop several feet away, regarding her silently for a long moment. "Madam," his voice was deep, cautious, "you shouldn't be out in this weather." "I had no choice," Zara managed, another contraction stealing her breath. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline shadowed with stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky, startling against the bleakness of the winter landscape. "You're with child," he stated, his gaze dropping to her belly. "Nothing escapes you, sir," Zara said through gritted teeth, immediately regretting her sharpness when another pain seized her. To her surprise, a smile quirked at the corner of his mouth. "Name's Bryce Xavier, madam. I've got a cabin not far from here." He looked at her critically. "Can you ride?" Zara shook her head, another contraction making her gasp. "I don't think so. The baby, I think it's coming." Concern flashed across his features. He glanced around at the rapidly darkening landscape, then back at her. "We need to get you somewhere warm." He stepped closer, removing his heavy coat and draping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it nearly made Zara weep. "I can't walk much further," she admitted. Bryce nodded, as if making up his mind about something. "Then you won't." He moved beside her, strong and solid. "Lean on me completely." Zara hesitated for only a moment before allowing herself to be guided against his side, his arm coming around her shoulders. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse," he explained, his breath warm against her frozen cheek. "I'll walk alongside and lead him. It's not far." "Why are you helping me?" Zara asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Bryce's expression softened. "My ma would haunt me till my dying day if I left a woman in your condition out here to freeze." He paused, then added more quietly, "Besides, no one should be alone on a night like this." Before she could respond, he lifted her with surprising gentleness, placing her sideways in his saddle. Her bundle of possessions he tied securely to the back. "Hold tight to the pommel," he instructed, placing her hands on the front of the saddle. Then he took the reins and began leading the horse through the snow. True to his word, the journey wasn't long, though, to Zara, racked with increasingly frequent contractions. It seemed to take hours. Eventually, the outline of a cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a solid structure nestled against the shelter of a rock outcropping, with smoke curling from its chimney. "Someone's there," Zara said, alarm rising in her voice. "Just my dog," Bryce replied. "And the fire I left banked before heading to town. We're safe here." Upon reaching the cabin, he helped her down from the horse, supporting most of her weight as another contraction hit. Zara cried out, unable to suppress the sound. "Easy now," he murmured, guiding her toward the door. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was blessedly warm compared to the frigid outdoors. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and a large black and brown dog rose from its place on a rug, tail wagging cautiously at the sight of a stranger. "That's Buck," Bryce said, helping Zara to a chair near the fire. "He won't bother you." To the dog he commanded, "Stay," before turning back to the door. "I need to see to my horse. I'll be quick." Zara nodded, too exhausted and pain-ridden to do much else. The cabin was simple but well-maintained, with a table and chairs, a small kitchen area, shelves lined with books, and a curtained-off section she assumed led to a bed. It was clean and orderly, not what she might have expected from a bachelor's dwelling. When Bryce returned, stomping snow from his boots, he immediately went to work, stoking the fire higher and putting water on to boil. He moved with the efficiency of a man used to taking care of himself. "How far apart are your pains?" he asked, removing his hat and hanging it by the door. His hair was the color of wheat, she noticed, cut short but unruly. "Not far," Zara admitted. "They're coming faster now." Bryce nodded, his expression serious. "I've delivered foals and calves, but never a baby. Is there anything I should know?" Despite her discomfort, Zara almost laughed at his directness. "I've never had a baby either, so I'm afraid we're both learning today." She winced as another contraction seized her. "But I helped the midwife in Tanapa several times. I know what needs to be done." "Tanapa? That's a hard day's ride from here. What were you doing out in this weather?" "Running," Zara replied honestly, too tired and in too much pain to fabricate a story. "From a man who thought he owned me because my husband owed him money." Something dark flashed in Bryce's eyes, but he simply nodded. "Well, you're safe here for now," he gestured to the curtained area. "There's a bed through there. Let's get you settled." The next hours passed in a blur of pain for Zara. Bryce proved to be a capable, if somewhat awkward, assistant, following her instructions without complaint, bringing water, clean cloths, and supporting her when the contractions became unbearable. His hands were large but gentle, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her pain. As midnight approached, Zara's labor intensified. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead despite the winter chill outside, and she gripped Bryce's offered hand with a strength that surprised them both. "You're doing fine," he assured her, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his words. "Just fine." "I can't," Zara gasped as another contraction tore through her. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Bryce replied firmly. "You're the woman who walked miles through a snowstorm to protect your child. This part's just the final stretch of that journey." His words, simple but sincere, gave her strength. With a cry that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin, Zara gave a final push, and her child slid into the world in Bryce's waiting hands. For a moment, there was silence and Zara's heart seemed to stop. Then, a lusty cry filled the small cabin and tears of relief spilled down her cheeks. "It's a boy," Bryce announced, a hint of wonder in his voice as he wrapped the squalling infant in a clean shirt and placed him in her arms. "A strong boy." Zara looked down at her son, his tiny face red and angry, his fists waving in protest at being thrust into the cold world. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "You've had quite the journey already, haven't you?" Bryce busied himself with cleaning up, giving her a moment of privacy with her child. When he returned, he brought her water and some dried meat and biscuits from his supplies. "You need to keep up your strength," he said, setting the food beside her. "For both of you." "Thank you," Zara said, the words wholly inadequate for what this stranger had done for her. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Bryce shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Zara replied, knowing all too well the cruelty people were capable of. "They wouldn't have." He didn't argue, just nodded toward the baby. "Does he have a name?" Zara looked down at her son. She had thought to name him after his father, but suddenly that felt like tying him to the past. This child deserved a fresh start, just as she was seeking one. "Benjamin," she decided. "It means son of my right hand, the one who helps and supports." She met Bryce's gaze. "It seems fitting, considering." A faint flush colored his cheeks. "It's a good name." He moved toward the door. "I'll give you some privacy. Call if you need anything." "Wait," Zara said, surprised by her reluctance to see him go. "Where will you sleep?" "By the fire," he replied. "I've slept in worse places." "This is your home. I'm the intruder here." Bryce shook his head. "You and Benjamin need the rest more than I do." He paused, then added, "We can figure out the rest tomorrow. For tonight, just know you're safe." With that, he disappeared beyond the curtain, leaving Zara alone with her son. She looked down at Benjamin, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "We're safe," she whispered, the words strange and wonderful on her tongue. "For tonight, at least, we're safe." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silent white, while inside the cabin, two strangers and a newborn child found temporary shelter from the storm. Dawn broke with a clarity that only follows a heavy snowfall, sunlight glinting off the pristine white landscape surrounding the cabin. Zara awoke to the sound of quiet movement and the scent of coffee brewing. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then Benjamin stirred beside her, making small, mewling sounds that quickly reminded her of everything that had transpired. She carefully sat up, wincing at the soreness that permeated her body. The events of the previous day, her flight from Tanapa, the treacherous journey through the snow, the unexpected encounter with Bryce Xavier, and finally, the birth of her son seemed almost dreamlike in the morning light. A soft knock on the wooden door frame preceded Bryce's voice. "Are you awake, Mrs. Miller?" "Yes," she replied, quickly adjusting her disheveled clothing and smoothing her hair. "And please call me Zara." The curtain parted slightly and Bryce appeared, holding a steaming mug. His hair was damp, as though he'd recently washed, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. Despite the circumstances, Zara found herself noticing the way the blue fabric matched his eyes. "I thought you might want some coffee," he said, offering her the mug. I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of breakfast, just some biscuits and jerky. I wasn't expecting company when I made my supply run yesterday." Zara accepted the coffee gratefully. "This is more than enough. I can't thank you enough for your help last night." Bryce glanced at Benjamin, who was beginning to fuss more insistently. "How is he?" "Hungry, I expect," Zara replied, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. Though she'd helped deliver babies before, the intimate aspects of motherhood were new territory. Understanding crossed Bryce's features. "I'll give you some privacy." He turned to go, then paused. "The snow's still deep, but the storm's past. Once you've rested, we can figure out what comes next." "What comes next?" The words hung in the air after he'd gone, leaving Zara to contemplate her limited options. She had no money, no home, and now a newborn to care for. Returning to Tanapa was out of the question. Hollister would make good on his threats if she dared show her face there again. But where could she go? What kind of life could she provide for her son? After nursing Benjamin and changing him using one of her few clean pieces of clothing, Zara made her way out to the main room of the cabin. Bryce was seated at the table, examining a map spread out before him. Buck, the dog, lay at his feet but lifted his head when Zara appeared, his tail thumping against the wooden floor. "There's more coffee if you'd like it," Bryce said without looking up. Zara moved to the stove where a pot of coffee still simmered. "Thank you for everything." She poured herself another cup and hesitated, then took a seat across from him at the table. "I know I'm imposing on your hospitality. Once the snow melts a bit, I'll be on my way." Bryce finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "And where exactly will you be going?" The blunt question caught her off guard. I don't know yet. West, maybe. I've heard California is a place where people can start over." "California is a long way from here, especially with a newborn and winter setting in." His tone wasn't judgmental, merely factual. "The snow won't clear enough for safe travel for at least a week, maybe more." Zara swallowed hard, fighting back the desperation that threatened to overwhelm her. "I can't stay here. I won't be a burden to you." "It's not a burden," Bryce said, his voice softening. "Look, I've got plenty of space here. Food's a bit scarce right now, but I can make another run to town once the trails clear a bit. You and Benjamin are welcome to stay until you've recovered your strength and figured out your next move." "Why?" Zara couldn't help asking. "Why would you do that for strangers?" Bryce was quiet for a long moment. "I know what it's like to be alone with nowhere to turn." He folded the map deliberately, his movements precise. 6 years ago, I came west with nothing but the clothes on my back and dreams of making my fortune. Reality didn't quite match up to those dreams. Yet you have this place," Zara observed, glancing around the modest but comfortable cabin. "I worked hard for it," he acknowledged. "Took jobs no one else wanted, saved every penny. Finally bought this land 3 years ago." A hint of pride colored his voice. "It's not much, but it's mine. No one can take it from me." The parallels to her own situation weren't lost on Zara. "I had a place like that once. Small, but it was ours, mine and Michael's." She absently stroked Benjamin's downy head as he slept in her arms. "Then the mine collapsed. They said Michael was careless, that it was his fault the support beams gave way. Used that as an excuse not to pay what they owed the families." Bryce's expression darkened. "Mines have a way of doing that. Blame the dead men who can't defend themselves." "You worked in the mines?" Zara asked, noting the bitterness in his tone. "For a time, in Colorado before coming to Nevada." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his wrist halfway up his forearm. "Got this when a cart derailed. Would have lost the arm if not for the doctor in town. That's when I decided there had to be a better way to make a living." "So what do you do now?" Zara found herself genuinely curious about this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. A little of everything. I raise some cattle, not many, just enough to get by. Do some hunting, trapping. In the spring and summer, I guide hunting parties from back east who want to experience the wild frontier. He said this last part with a wry smile. Turns out rich folks will pay good money to sleep on the ground and shoot at things that don't shoot back. Despite herself, Zara laughed. The sound seemed to brighten the cabin, and even Benjamin stirred, his tiny face scrunching up before settling back to sleep. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," Bryce observed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's a nice sound." Zara felt her cheeks warm. "Haven't had much cause for laughter lately." "No, I expect not." Bryce rose from the table. "I need to check on the livestock. The cows are in the barn, but they'll need feed and water." "Will you be all right for a bit?" "We'll be fine," Zara assured him. "Do you mind if I look around for something to use as swaddling for Benjamin? I didn't exactly pack for his arrival when I left Tanapa." "Help yourself to whatever you can find. There's a trunk at the foot of the bed with some extra blankets. They're clean enough, though they might be a bit rough for a baby." After Bryce had donned his coat and headed out, Zara carefully laid Benjamin on a folded blanket near the fire and went to explore the cabin more thoroughly. It consisted of the main room with its fireplace, table, and cooking area, plus the small bedroom where she'd spent the night. A ladder led to a loft space that appeared to be used for storage. The trunk at the foot of the bed contained several wool blankets as promised, along with a quilt that, while worn, was softer than the others. Zara set it aside for Benjamin. As she continued her search, she found herself drawn to the small collection of books on a shelf near the fireplace. They were well worn, their spines creased with use of volume of Shakespeare's works, a Bible, a book on animal husbandry, and several penny dreadfuls with lurid titles about outlaws and lawmen. The domestic touches surprised her. Bryce Xavier didn't strike her as the bookish type, yet the evidence suggested he valued more than just survival in his isolated existence. Near the book sat a small carved wooden horse, its details suggesting it had been made by skilled hands. She wondered if it was Bryce's work or a keepsake from someone else. A framed daguerreotype on the mantel caught her attention. It showed a stern-looking man in his 40s, a woman with kind eyes, and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The older boy, perhaps 12 in the image, had Bryce's distinctive eyes and determined jawline. "That's my family," Bryce's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him return. "Taken about a year before my mother died." "I'm sorry," Zara said, carefully replacing the photograph. "I didn't mean to pry. It's not prying to be curious about the man whose roof you're under." He removed his snow-crusted coat and hung it by the door. "That was taken in Missouri, where I grew up. My father was a blacksmith, expected me to follow in his footsteps. But you didn't." "No." "After Mother died, he changed, became harder, more demanding. When the war ended and people started talking about opportunities out west, I saw my chance and took it." He moved to the fireplace, warming his hands. "Haven't been back since." "You ever regret it? Leaving, I mean?" Bryce considered the question. "I regret how I left, not saying a proper goodbye to my sister and brother. But no, I don't regret coming west. This land has its challenges, but there's a freedom here I never found back east." Zara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's what Michael used to say. That out here a person could become whoever they wanted to be, not just who they were born to be." "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "In some ways," Zara admitted. "In others, not so much. He was convinced he'd strike it rich in the mines, that we'd build a grand house and fill it with fine things." She looked down at Benjamin, now awake and watching her with dark, unfocused eyes. Dreams don't feed babies or keep the cold at bay. No, but without dreams, what's the point of all the rest? Bryce moved to the kitchen area, taking out supplies for their meal. Were you born in Tanapa? No, I came from back east too, Pennsylvania. My father was a clerk in a textile mill. Zara shifted Benjamin to her shoulder, patting his back gently. When the mill closed, there wasn't much left for any of us. I met Michael at a church social. He had such grand plans, such confidence. When he talked about going west, it seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. And was it? An adventure, Zara considered the question. Parts of it were wonderful. The journey itself, seeing the country change as we traveled, the vastness of it all. Even Tanapa, when we first arrived, seemed full of possibility. She sighed. But reality has a way of asserting itself. The work was hard, the conditions poor. Still, we were managing until the accident. Bryce nodded, understanding in his expression. Life out here can change in an instant, for better or worse. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Bryce tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped near the entrance. "Are you expecting anyone?" Zara whispered, clutching Benjamin closer. "No," Bryce replied, his voice equally low. "Stay back." He approached the door cautiously, keeping to the side as he called out. "Who's there?" "It's Owen Sullivan, Bryce. From the Double S Ranch to the north. Got caught in the storm yesterday and saw smoke from your chimney." Bryce visibly relaxed, though he kept his hand near the rifle as he opened the door. A man stood there, snow covering his heavy coat and hat, his beard frosted with ice. "Sullivan," Bryce greeted him, stepping back to allow the man entry. "Didn't expect to see anyone on the trails today." "Wouldn't be out in this if I had a choice," Sullivan replied, stomping snow from his boots before entering. His eyes widened when he spotted Zara and the baby. "I see you've got company." "This is Zara Miller and her son, Benjamin," Bryce said, his tone neutral but with an underlying firmness that suggested he wouldn't welcome questions. "They're staying with me for a while." Sullivan nodded, though curiosity was evident in his weathered face. "Madam," he greeted Zara with a tip of his hat. "Mighty cold day to be out with a little one." "Mr. Xavier was kind enough to offer us shelter," Zara replied, keeping her explanation vague. Sullivan seemed to accept this, turning back to Bryce. "I'm headed to Tanapa for supplies. Wondered if you needed anything while I'm there." Zara couldn't help the small gasp that escaped her at the mention of Tanapa. Both men looked at her, and she quickly composed her features, but not before Bryce had registered her reaction. "Actually, I could use a few things," Bryce said, moving to get paper and pencil. "If you don't mind waiting, I'll make a list." While he wrote, Sullivan continued to glance curiously at Zara. "You from Tanapa, madam?" "Just passing through," Zara answered, her throat dry with fear. What if this man knew Hollister? What if he mentioned seeing her here? "Sullivan runs cattle on the spread north of here," Bryce explained, seemingly casual but clearly trying to redirect the conversation. "Been in these parts longer than most." "Since '62, Sullivan confirmed, accepting the shift in topic. "Seen a lot of changes, lot of people come and go." He looked at the list Bryce handed him. "This is quite a bit. Sure you don't want to come into town yourself?" "Can't leave the livestock, not with wolves spotted in the area last week," Bryce replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins. "This should cover it." Sullivan pocketed the money and the list. "I'll be back this way in 3 days, God willing, and the creek don't rise." He glanced at Zara again. "Pleasure meeting you, madam. That's a fine-looking boy you've got there." "Thank you," Zara murmured, relief flooding her as the man prepared to leave. Once Sullivan had gone, Bryce turned to her, his expression concerned. "You went white as a sheet when he mentioned Tanapa. Is there something I should know? Zara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The man I was running from, the one who wanted my husband's debts paid. He has influence in Tanapa if he learns where I am. You think Sullivan would tell him? I don't know. I don't know who I can trust. The admission cost her, laying bare the vulnerability she'd been trying so hard to conceal. Bryce's expression softened. Sullivan's a good man, but you're right to be cautious. This country runs on gossip as much as gold and cattle. He paused, considering. If you're worried, we can come up with a story, something that won't raise questions if word gets back to town. What kind of story? Zara asked. The simplest one. That you're my widowed sister, come to stay with me after losing your husband. The idea was practical, but something about claiming to be Bryce's sister felt wrong to Zara in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Would people believe that? They'll believe what they want to believe, Bryce said with a shrug. But it gives you a reason to be here, and it keeps anyone from asking too many questions about where you came from or why. Zara nodded slowly. All right, if anyone else comes by, I'm your sister. Good. Bryce turned back to the stove where a pot of stew was simmering. Now let's eat. You need to keep up your strength. As they shared the simple meal, Zara found herself watching Bryce when he wasn't looking. He moved with a quiet confidence around his home, efficient in his movements, deliberate in his words. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring, especially after the chaos of the past months. What will you do when spring comes? He asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Zara looked down at Benjamin, now sleeping peacefully in her arms after nursing. I don't know, she admitted. Find work somewhere, I suppose. Save up enough to move on to California eventually. What kind of work? I can cook, clean, so I worked as a laundress in Tanapa for a while before. She trailed off, not wanting to mention her pregnancy directly. Before circumstances changed, Bryce nodded thoughtfully. The nearest town with steady work for a woman with those skills would be Carson City, and that's a good 60 miles from here. He hesitated, then added, there might be another option. Zara looked up, curious. What's that? Stay here, at least until Benjamin's older and traveling would be easier on both of you. He rushed on before she could respond. I could use the help, truth be told. This place takes work to maintain, and with spring coming, there will be calves to tend to, a garden to plant. I'd pay you fair wages, of course. The offer caught Zara off guard. You barely know me. I know enough, Bryce replied simply. I know you're brave enough to flee into a snowstorm rather than compromise your principles. I know you're strong enough to give birth in a stranger's cabin without complaint. And I know that boy of yours deserves a safe place to grow, at least for a while. Tears pricked at Zara's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Why are you being so kind to us? Bryce seemed uncomfortable with the question. It's not kindness to recognize a good arrangement when I see one. You need a safe place. I need help around here. It's practical for both of us. Though his words framed the offer in terms of mutual benefit, Zara sensed there was more to it, perhaps a loneliness he wouldn't admit to, or a decency he was too modest to claim. I'll think about it, she promised, not ready to commit, but touched by the offer nonetheless. Bryce nodded, accepting her hesitation. That's fair. You've got time to decide. For now, just focus on healing and taking care of your boy. That night, as Zara lay in Bryce's bed with Benjamin nestled beside her, she found herself thinking about the turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been certain she would die in the snow, taking her unborn child with her. Now, she had a roof over her head, a warm bed, and an offer of steady work and safety. It seemed too good to be true, and in Zara's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Yet there was something about Bryce Xavier that inspired trust, despite her best instincts. Perhaps it was the way he'd cared for her without expectation, or the gentleness with which he'd helped bring Benjamin into the world. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time since Michael's death, someone had looked at her and seen not just a widow or a potential conquest, but a person worthy of respect and dignity. Whatever the reason, as she drifted off to sleep with her son's tiny hand curled around her finger, Zara found herself hoping that, just this once, the universe might be kind. The days that followed fell into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Bryce insisted that Zara continue to use his bed while he slept on a pallet near the fireplace, arguing that she needed proper rest to recover from childbirth. Though she protested this arrangement initially, the genuine exhaustion of new motherhood soon had her accepting his generosity with gratitude. By the third day, Zara felt strong enough to move around the cabin more freely, taking over simple cooking tasks and learning the layout of Bryce's modest home. She discovered that he was meticulous about some things. His tools were always cleaned and put away properly. His small library of books arranged by size, but charmingly careless about others. His method of folding clothes, for instance, seemed to involve crumpling them into roughly rectangular shapes and shoving them into drawers. "Have you never heard of an iron?" she teased, holding up a shirt so wrinkled it might have been used as a map of the mountain range. Bryce looked up from where he was mending a bridle at the table, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Never seemed worth the trouble for just me." Zara shook her head, unable to suppress a smile. "Well, there's more than just you now, at least for the time being." The casual acknowledgement that they were sharing a home, however temporarily, hung in the air between them. Bryce returned to his mending, but Zara caught the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth. On the fourth day, as promised, Owen Sullivan returned with the supplies Bryce had requested. This time, Zara was prepared for the visit, having rehearsed her role as Bryce's widowed sister. Sullivan didn't stay long, merely dropping off the goods and exchanging brief pleasantries before continuing on his way back to his own ranch. "Did he say anything about Tanapa?" Zara asked anxiously after Sullivan had gone. Bryce shook his head. "Nothing specific. Just that the town was busy despite the weather." He began unpacking the supplies, which included not only basic necessities like flour, sugar, and coffee, but also several yards of soft flannel, a packet of sewing needles, and a small tin of hard candies. "What's all this?" Zara asked, running her fingers over the flannel. "Thought you might want to make some proper clothes for Benjamin," Bryce replied, not meeting her eyes as he continued unpacking. "And the candies? Well, I figured you might have a sweet tooth. Most women do." The thoughtfulness of these unexpected items touched Zara deeply. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to express the fullness of her gratitude without risking tears. Bryce merely nodded, clearly uncomfortable with her thanks. "It's nothing. Practical things, that's all." But they both knew it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement that she and Benjamin weren't just temporary guests, but people with needs and comforts of their own. That evening, after Benjamin had been fed and settled in a makeshift cradle Bryce had fashioned from a wooden crate lined with the quilt, they sat together by the fire. Bryce whittled at a small piece of wood with precise, careful strokes, while Zara worked on cutting patterns for baby clothes from the flannel. "My mother taught me to sew when I was 8, Zara said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She said every woman should know how to clothe her family, even if she had the money to buy ready-made." "Sounds like wise advice," Bryce replied, his eyes on his carving. "My mother was the same way about cooking. Said a man who couldn't feed himself was at the mercy of others' kitchens." Zara smiled at that. Is that why you're such a good cook? I wouldn't go that far, Bryce chuckled. But I can manage a stew that won't poison anyone and biscuits that are more bread than rock. Most of the time, anyway. That's more than Michael could do. He once tried to surprise me with breakfast and nearly burned down our cabin. The memory, which had once been painful, now brought a fond smile to Zara's face. He was a good man in many ways, but domestic skills weren't his strong suit. How long were you married? Bryce asked, his tone casual but his eyes attentive. 2 years. We married young. I was barely 19 and he was 22, full of dreams and not much else. Zara sighed. Sometimes I think if we'd waited, been more practical. But then I look at Benjamin and I can't regret the path that brought him to me. Bryce nodded, understanding in his expression. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. What about you? Zara asked, curious. Have you ever been married? No. The answer was simple but not curt. Came close once, back in Colorado. Her name was Eliza. Her father owned the general store in the mining town where I worked. What happened? Bryce's hand stilled on his carving. The mine closed. Men were let go, including me. I asked her to come with me to Nevada, where I'd heard there was work, but she didn't want to leave her family. A shadow crossed his face. Can't say I blame her. Security is a powerful thing. Yet here you are, making your own way. Here I am, he agreed, his expression lightening. And I've got no regrets about that. This land has been good to me for the most part. He held up the piece he was carving, which Zara now saw was taking the shape of a small bird. Found a fox in one of my snares yesterday. Reminded me that life finds a way to survive, even in the harshest conditions. The next week brought a brief thaw, the snow melting enough for Bryce to check his trap lines and hunt for fresh meat. Zara found herself settling into the routine of the cabin, caring for Benjamin, cooking meals and mending clothes that had long needed attention. She discovered she enjoyed the quiet simplicity of their days, so different from the constant noise and chaos of Tanapa. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Bryce cleared his throat nervously. I've been thinking about your situation. Zara looked up from her sewing, a small flutter of anxiety in her chest. Oh, spring will be here before we know it. If you're still planning to move on, I'd understand, but... He hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of his words. But I want you to know that my offer stands. You and Benjamin are welcome to stay, not just for a season, but for as long as you want. Zara set down her sewing, studying his face in the firelight. Why would you want us to stay? You must have plans of your own, dreams that don't include a widow and someone else's child. My dream has always been simple, to build something of my own, something that would last. Bryce met her gaze steadily. But I've come to realize that a home without people to share it with is just a building, nothing more. And you think we could make it a home? Zara asked softly. I think you already have, Bryce admitted. These past weeks, having you and Benjamin here. It's reminded me what it's like to have a family, to have something beyond myself to care about. The honesty of his words touched Zara deeply. Since Michael's death, she'd grown accustomed to men who saw her as either an object of pity or desire. Bryce saw her as a person, complete and valuable in her own right. I'm not asking for anything from you, Bryce continued when she didn't immediately respond. Just offering you a choice. Stay if you want, go if you need to. Either way, you'll have my support. Zara found herself at a crossroads. The practical part of her recognized the security Bryce offered: a safe home for Benjamin, honest work for herself, protection from men like Hollister. But another part, a part she'd thought died with Michael, recognized something else in Bryce's offer. The possibility of starting anew, of building something based not on desperate necessity but on mutual respect and growing affection. "I'd like to stay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within her. "At least until I can repay you for your kindness." Something flashed in Bryce's eyes, relief perhaps, or joy quickly masked. "There's nothing to repay, but I'm glad you'll stay." The moment was interrupted by Benjamin's cry from his cradle. Zara rose to tend to him, but as she passed Bryce, she impulsively placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing far more than just his offer of a home. Bryce covered her hand with his own just for a moment, the brief contact warming her more than the fire ever could. "You're welcome." As February gave way to March, the snow began to recede in earnest, revealing patches of earth hungry for spring's touch. Bryce spent more time outdoors, preparing for the calving season and readying the small plot behind the cabin for planting. Zara, now fully recovered from childbirth, insisted on contributing more to the household, taking over the cooking entirely and venturing outside on milder days to help with manageable tasks. One crisp morning, Bryce announced he needed to ride to the neighboring ranch to discuss grazing arrangements for the coming season. "I'll be gone most of the day," he told Zara as he pulled on his coat. "Will you be all right here with Benjamin?" "We'll be fine," Zara assured him, bouncing a now 6-week-old Benjamin in her arms. The baby had grown remarkably in the weeks since his birth, his cheeks filling out, his dark eyes more alert and curious about the world around him. "I thought I might air out the cabin while you're gone." "It's warm enough today," Bryce nodded approvingly. "Good idea. Just keep your eyes open. Spring brings out more than just flowers. Bears are waking up hungry, and there have been reports of raiders hitting isolated homesteads to the east." Zara's eyes widened slightly at this news. "Raiders?" "Like outlaws. Mostly desperate men down on their luck from what I hear, but desperate men can be dangerous." Bryce moved to the cabinet where he kept his firearms and retrieved a pistol. "Do you know how to use one of these?" "Michael taught me the basics," Zara replied, eyeing the weapon with a mixture of respect and trepidation. "Though I've never had to shoot at anything but tin cans. Let's hope it stays that way." Bryce checked that the gun was loaded before placing it on the high shelf near the door. "It's there if you need it, but I expect you won't. Buck will warn you if anyone approaches. He's a good judge of character, barks his head off at troublemakers, but stays quiet for friends." As if understanding he was being discussed, Buck thumped his tail against the floor, looking up at Bryce with devoted eyes. "You keep them safe, boy," Bryce instructed the dog, scratching him behind the ears. To Zara he added, "I'll be back before dark. If I'm delayed for any reason, there's extra wood stacked by the fireplace." After he'd gone, the cabin seemed strangely empty despite Benjamin's occasional coos and Buck's vigilant presence. Zara busied herself with household tasks, finding comfort in the routine of caring for a home that was beginning to feel like her own. By midday, with Benjamin napping peacefully in his cradle and the weather holding fair, Zara decided to open the windows and let the fresh spring air sweep through the cabin. As she worked, she found herself humming a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, the melody bringing back bittersweet memories of home. She was so absorbed in her work and memories that at first she didn't notice Buck's change in demeanor. The dog, who had been dozing near Benjamin's cradle, suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Zara froze, her heart stuttering with sudden fear. "What is it, Buck?" The dog rose to his feet, moving to the door with purpose, his growl deepening. Through the open window, Zara heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching, not the single horse she would expect if Bryce were returning early, but multiple riders. Remembering Bryce's warning about raiders, Zara quickly but quietly closed and latched the windows. She moved to Benjamin's cradle, ready to snatch him up if necessary, and called Buck to her side. The dog came reluctantly, his attention still fixed on the approaching threat. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his head to calm both him and herself. "We'll be quiet now." The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed as they approached the cabin. Zara's mouth went dry with fear. Should she reach for the gun, hide with Benjamin, make a stand at the door? Before she could decide, a familiar voice called out, "Hello, the cabin, anyone home?" It was Owen Sullivan, and he wasn't alone. Zara hesitated, relief warring with caution. Sullivan had seemed friendly enough on his previous visits, but Bryce had warned her to be careful. "Mrs. Miller, it's Owen Sullivan. Got some folks here from Tanapa looking for you." Ice flooded Zara's veins. Tanapa. Had Hollister found her after all? Buck's growl intensified, confirming her fears. Whatever threat awaited outside, the dog sensed it clearly. Moving as quietly as possible, Zara reached for the pistol Bryce had left for her, checking it as he had shown her. Then, with Benjamin now awake and clutched protectively to her chest, she approached the door. "What do you want, Mr. Sullivan?" she called through the closed door, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just to talk, madam. Fellow here says he's been looking for you, says it's important." "And who might that be?" Zara demanded, her finger hovering near the trigger of the gun. There was a pause, then a different voice answered, one that sent a chill down Zara's spine. "It's Vernon Hollister, Mrs. Miller. I believe you and I have unfinished business." Zara's worst fears were confirmed. Somehow, Hollister had traced her to Bryce's cabin. Had Sullivan betrayed her? Or had someone else from Tanapa recognized her description and reported back? "I have no business with you, Mr. Hollister," Zara replied, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. "Please leave this property immediately." "Now, Mrs. Miller, that's no way to treat a man who's ridden all this way in your interest." Hollister's voice carried the false charm she remembered all too well. "Your husband owed me a considerable sum when he died. I'm simply here to collect what's rightfully mine." "Michael owed you nothing," Zara retorted, anger momentarily overriding her fear. "The mine collapse was due to your negligence, not his. If anything, you owe compensation to all the widows your greed created." A tense silence followed her accusation, then Hollister's voice came again, harder now. "I see you're still clinging to that fantasy. No matter. One way or another I'll collect what I'm owed, whether that's in coin or other arrangements." The implication was clear, and it made Zara's blood boil. "Mr. Hollister, I am armed and prepared to defend myself and my child. This is not my property, but I have permission to be here. You are trespassing. Leave now or face the consequences." Hollister's laugh was cold. "Brave words from a woman alone. Where's your protector, Mrs. Miller?" "The rancher who's been harboring you. Off attending to his cattle, I expect." The fact that Hollister knew Bryce was away sent a fresh wave of fear through Zara. They'd been watching the cabin, waiting for an opportunity when she was vulnerable. "Sullivan," Hollister commanded, "check around back. See if there's another way in." "Now wait just a minute, Hollister." Sullivan's voice held surprise and growing alarm. "You said you wanted to talk to the woman about a debt, not break into someone's home. I won't be party to that." "You're already party to it, old man," Hollister snapped. "You led me here, didn't you? Because you said it was legal business. If I'd known you meant to threaten a woman with child, enough." Hollister cut him off. "Williams, Jenkins, see to the back. I'll handle the front door. And Sullivan, if you value that ranching operation of yours, you'll remember who controls the water rights in this territory." Zara heard footsteps moving away from the front of the cabin, presumably Hollister's men heading for the rear. Buck's growl deepened, and he moved restlessly between the front door and the back window, clearly agitated by the encroaching threat. With her heart pounding, Zara made a quick decision. She couldn't fight off 3 men alone, not while protecting Benjamin. Their best chance was to flee and try to find Bryce or reach another homestead where she might find help. Moving swiftly, she placed Benjamin in his cradle and dragged it near the rear window, which was smaller and higher off the ground than the front entrance. If she could slip out with the baby before Hollister's men reached the back of the cabin. A sudden pounding at the front door made her jump. "Open up, Mrs. Miller," Hollister demanded. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Zara ignored him, focusing on her escape plan. She unlatched the back window as quietly as possible and pushed it open. The drop to the ground wasn't far, perhaps 4 feet, but managing it while holding Benjamin would be tricky. Buck, sensing her intentions, positioned himself by the front door, his growl now a continuous warning that any attempt to breach the entrance would be met with fierce resistance. "Good boy," Zara whispered. "Buy us time." She carefully lifted Benjamin from his cradle, wrapping him securely in a blanket to protect him from the chill air. Then, with one last glance around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, Zara hoisted herself onto the windowsill, swung her legs over, and dropped as gently as possible to the ground outside. The impact jarred her knees, but she managed to keep her balance and protect Benjamin from the jolt. The baby, startled by the sudden movement and cold air, began to whimper. "Shh, little one," Zara soothed, pressing him close to her chest. "We need to be very quiet now." She heard voices approaching from around the side of the cabin. Hollister's men, no doubt. With no time to deliberate, Zara sprinted for the nearby tree line, praying that the sound of her footsteps would be masked by the men's own movements and Buck's increasingly frantic barking from inside the cabin. Just as she reached the shelter of the first trees, a shout went up behind her. "There she goes! Around the back!" Zara didn't look back, just pressed deeper into the forest, searching for a path through the underbrush that would allow her to move quickly while leaving minimal trail. She knew these woods, somewhat from her walks with Bryce, but not well enough to navigate them confidently, especially not in haste. Behind her, she could hear men crashing through the underbrush, their curses floating on the spring air as branches whipped at their faces and hidden roots threatened to trip them. At least in that, she had an advantage. She was lighter and could move more nimbly through the tight spaces. Benjamin, sensing his mother's fear, began to cry in earnest, the sound piercing the forest quiet. "There!" a voice called, much closer than Zara had hoped. "I hear the brat." Desperation lent her speed as she pushed deeper into the forest, angling toward where she thought Bryce might be returning from his neighbor's ranch, if she could intercept him on the trail. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just feet from Zara's head. She gasped, instinctively ducking lower, shielding Benjamin with her body. "Hold your fire, you idiot," Hollister's voice commanded. "I want her alive." The momentary distraction gave Zara a chance to change direction, veering sharply to the right and scrambling down a small embankment toward a creek she knew ran through Bryce's property. The water was high with spring melt, moving swiftly over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Zara paused at the water's edge, her mind racing. Crossing would be dangerous with Benjamin in her arms, but staying on this side meant certain capture. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the icy current, gasping as the cold water soaked through her boots and skirts. The creek bed was slippery with moss, and the current stronger than she'd anticipated. Halfway across, her foot slid on a rock, and for a heart-stopping moment, she nearly lost her balance. Only a desperate grab at an overhanging branch saved her and Benjamin from being swept downstream. I see her. In the creek. A voice shouted from the bank she'd just left. With renewed urgency, Zara pressed forward, fighting the current with every step. By the time she reached the far bank, her skirts were soaked to the waist, and her arms ached from the strain of keeping Benjamin high and dry against her chest. The baby was wailing now, distressed by the commotion and the cold. Zara murmured soothing words to him, though she doubted he could hear them over his own cries and the sounds of pursuit. As she struggled up the muddy bank, the sound of hoofbeats reached her ears not from behind, but from ahead. For a wild, hopeful moment, she thought Bryce had returned early and heard the commotion. But the rider who appeared through the trees was not Bryce. It was a stranger, a man in a battered hat and worn coat, his weathered face registering surprise at the sight of a woman with a baby struggling up from the creek. "Help me," Zara cried, desperation overriding caution. "Please, these men are trying to take my baby." The stranger assessed the situation quickly, taking in Zara's bedraggled appearance, the crying infant, and the sounds of pursuit drawing nearer. Without a word, he guided his horse closer to the bank and extended a gloved hand. "Give me the child," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Then take my hand. Quick now." Zara hesitated for only a second before placing Benjamin in the stranger's secure grip. Then she grasped the offered hand and was pulled with surprising strength onto the horse behind the rider. "Hold tight," the man instructed, passing Benjamin back to her once she was settled. "And keep your head down." He wheeled the horse around just as Hollister and one of his men emerged from the trees on the opposite bank of the creek. "Stop right there," Hollister shouted, raising his pistol. "That woman is a thief. She's stolen what belongs to me." The stranger's only response was to spur his horse forward, away from the creek and deeper into the forest. Behind them, Zara heard another shot, but it went wide, the bullet thudding harmlessly into a tree trunk as they galloped away. "Who are you?" Zara asked, clinging to her rescuer with one arm while cradling Benjamin with the other. "Name's Cody," the man replied without slowing their pace. "Friend of Bryce Xavier's, was heading to his place when I heard the commotion." He glanced back at her, his expression serious. "And you must be the widow he mentioned, with the new baby." Relief flooded through Zara. "Yes, I'm Zara Miller. This is Benjamin. How did you know about us?" Ran into Bryce in Carson City last week. "He mentioned he had guests staying with him, said you might be staying on permanent like." The knowledge that Bryce had spoken about them to his friend, possibly with plans for a long-term arrangement, warmed Zara despite her wet clothes and the chill air. "Where is Bryce now?" she asked, worried for his safety when he returned to find Hollister and his men at the cabin. "Headed back to the cabin last I saw him. Was about an hour behind me on the trail." Cody guided his horse expertly through the trees, following what appeared to be a game trail rarely used by humans. "Those men back there, they from Tanapa?" "Yes," Zara confirmed, her voice tight with fear and anger. "The one in charge is Vernon Hollister. He owns the mine where my husband worked before he died. Claims Michael owed him money, but it's a lie. He just—" She trailed off, not wanting to speak of Hollister's true intentions in front of a stranger. Cody seemed to understand without further explanation. "Men like that think they own everything and everyone. Been that way since time began." He urged his horse up a steep incline, the animal responding with sure-footed determination. "We'll circle around to approach Bryce's place from the north. If your pursuers are still there, they won't be expecting us from that direction." The ride seemed to take hours, though in reality it was likely less than one. Benjamin, exhausted from his ordeal, had finally stopped crying and fallen into an uneasy sleep against Zara's chest. Her own limbs were numb with cold and the tension of maintaining her precarious position on horseback, but fear for Bryce kept her alert. As they neared the cabin from the northern approach, Cody slowed their pace, moving with greater caution. "Best to see what we're riding into," he murmured, guiding his horse to the edge of a small rise that overlooked Bryce's property. From their vantage point, they could see the cabin and its surrounding outbuildings clearly. Two horses that Zara didn't recognize were tethered outside, presumably belonging to Hollister's men. Of Sullivan and his mount, there was no sign. "Looks like at least some of them returned to the cabin," Cody observed, "probably figuring you'd circle back eventually." Zara's heart sank at the thought of Bryce returning to find intruders in his home. "We have to warn Bryce." "Agreed," Cody said grimly. "But first, we need to get you and the little one somewhere safe." He scanned the horizon thoughtfully. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north of here. Bryce uses it when working the far pastures. Not much to look at, but it's solid enough and has basic supplies." "I can't just hide while Bryce rides into danger," Zara protested. "You've got that child to think of," Cody reminded her gently. "And you're half frozen from that creek. Best thing you can do for Bryce is stay safe so he doesn't have to worry about you while dealing with those men." Reluctantly, Zara nodded. The responsible part of her knew Cody was right. Benjamin's safety had to come first. "Once you're settled at the shack, I'll double back and try to intercept Bryce before he reaches the cabin," Cody continued. "With any luck, we can surprise these intruders instead of the other way around." With that plan agreed upon, they continued north toward the line shack. As they rode, Zara found herself reflecting on how quickly Bryce had become important to her, not just as a provider of shelter, but as someone whose safety and well-being mattered deeply. The thought of him facing Hollister's wrath on her behalf filled her with a mixture of gratitude and dread. The line shack, when they reached it, was indeed basic: a single room with a small iron stove, a narrow cot, and shelves stocked with essential supplies. But after their flight through the forest, it looked like a palace to Zara's weary eyes. "There's dry wood stacked inside," Cody told her as he helped her dismount. "Get a fire going and change into something dry. There should be some spare clothes of Bryce's in the trunk under the cot. They'll be too big, but better than what you're wearing now." Zara nodded, cradling a still sleeping Benjamin close. "Thank you, Mr. Cody, for everything." The man tipped his hat, a hint of a smile softening his weathered features. "Just Cody's fine, madam, and no thanks needed. Any friend of Bryce's is a friend of mine." He checked his pistol, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "I'll head back now to find Bryce. Bar the door after I go and don't open it for anyone but me or Bryce." "Understood." "Understood," Zara confirmed, her jaw set with determination. "But please be careful. Hollister is dangerous." "So am I when pushed," Cody replied with a grim smile. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Miller. We'll handle this." After Cody left, Zara quickly set about making the line shack as warm and comfortable as possible. She laid Benjamin on the cot, surrounded by pillows to prevent him from rolling, and set to work on the stove. Once a fire was crackling merrily, she searched the trunk for dry clothing as Cody had suggested. As predicted, Bryce's spare clothes were comically large on her frame, but they were clean and, more importantly, dry. She hung her sodden dress and petticoats near the stove to dry, then sat on the edge of the cot, watching Benjamin sleep and straining her ears for any sound of approaching riders. Time passed with agonizing slowness. Benjamin awoke hungry and Zara nursed him, grateful that at least she could provide this comfort. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. Worry gnawed at her insides. Had Cody found Bryce in time? Were they safe, or had Hollister's men gotten the upper hand? And what of Sullivan? Had he truly been an unwitting accomplice in Hollister's scheme, or was his apparent change of heart just an act? These questions circled in Zara's mind like hungry wolves, finding no answers but feeding on her fear nonetheless. She had just placed a freshly fed and changed Benjamin back on the cot when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Moving as silently as possible, Zara retrieved the rifle she'd found mounted above the door and positioned herself behind the small window, peering cautiously through the gathering dusk. Relief flooded through her at the sight of not one, but two familiar figures approaching on horseback, Cody and Bryce. She quickly unbarred the door and flung it open, the rifle still clutched in one hand. Bryce dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face tight with concern that melted into visible relief when he saw her standing in the doorway. "Zara," he breathed, crossing the distance between them in long strides. "Are you all right, Benjamin?" "We're both fine," she assured him, suddenly fighting tears. "Thanks to Cody. He found us just in time." Bryce turned to his friend, who was dismounting more slowly, a slight grimace revealing discomfort. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "Nonsense," Cody replied with a dismissive wave. "You'd have done the same for me. Besides, it was worth it to see the look on Hollister's face when we showed up." Zara's attention sharpened. "What happened? Did you confront Hollister?" Bryce guided her back into the warmth of the shack, his hand gentle on her elbow. "Let's get inside. It's getting cold, and this is a story best told by the fire." Once they were all settled, Zara checking on a still sleeping Benjamin, Bryce adding wood to the stove, and Cody easing himself onto a wooden chair with a barely suppressed whence the tale emerged. "I found Bryce about halfway back to the cabin," Cody began. "Told him what I'd seen and where I'd left you. We decided to approach the cabin cautiously from different directions. When we got there," Bryce continued, his voice tight with controlled anger, "Hollister and his men had made themselves at home. They'd ransacked the place looking for valuables, but seemed most interested in finding you. Sullivan was still there too," Cody added. "Though from what I could gather, he wasn't happy about how things had turned out. Kept saying Hollister had lied to him about the nature of his business with you." Bryce's expression darkened. "Hollister claimed you'd stolen from him before fleeing Tanapa. Said he had every right to reclaim his property. When I pointed out that taking a woman and child by force wasn't reclaiming property by any definition, he got nasty. That's when things got interesting," Cody said with a grim smile. "Hollister pulled his gun, but he wasn't expecting Bryce to be quite so quick on the draw." Zara looked at Bryce in alarm. "You didn't kill him, did you? Not that Hollister didn't deserve it, but the thought of Bryce facing murder charges on her behalf was unbearable." "No," Bryce assured her. "Though I was tempted. I just made it clear that he was trespassing on my property and threatening people under my protection." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I might have suggested that if he didn't leave immediately, he'd be returning to Tanapa with considerably more holes in him than he arrived with." "It was a sight to behold," Cody chuckled, then winced as the movement jarred whatever injury he was nursing. "Hollister tried to argue that you were a debtor, that he had legal rights, but Sullivan unexpectedly backed Bryce up. Said he'd been misled about Hollister's intentions and wanted no part in threatening a new mother." "What happened to your side?" Zara asked Cody, noting the way he held himself carefully, one hand hovering protectively over his ribs. "One of Hollister's men took exception to our interference," Cody admitted. "Got in a lucky punch before Bryce persuaded him of the error of his ways." "Persuaded?" Zara raised an eyebrow. "With the butt of his rifle," Bryce clarified without a hint of remorse. "The man will have a headache for a day or two, but he'll live." Zara sank onto the edge of the cot, the full weight of the day's events finally crashing down on her. So Hollister's gone, just like that? For now, Bryce said cautiously. He made some threats about returning with the law, claiming you'd stolen from him, but Sullivan cut him off. Said he'd testify that Hollister had broken into my home with the intent to abduct you and Benjamin if any charges were brought. Sullivan may have been fooled initially, but he's no fool in general, Cody added. He knows every rancher in the territory would turn against him if he stood with a man who threatened a woman and child. So, what happens now? Zara asked, her voice small in the quiet of the line shack. Bryce moved to sit beside her on the cot, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. That depends on you. The cabin's a mess, but nothing that can't be put right. We can return there tomorrow, or... He hesitated, then forged ahead. Or if you no longer feel safe there, I understand. I can help you get to Carson City, or even California if that's still what you want. The thought of leaving, of never again seeing the quiet strength in Bryce's eyes or feeling the security of his presence, sent an unexpected pang through Zara's heart. In the weeks since Benjamin's birth, Bryce had become more than a benefactor or even a friend. He had become someone she looked forward to seeing each morning, someone whose rare smiles she treasured, someone she had begun to imagine a future with, however unlikely that might have seemed a short time ago. I don't want to leave, she said softly, meeting his gaze directly. Not unless you want us to. Something flickered in Bryce's eyes, hope perhaps, or relief. I want you to stay, he replied, his voice equally soft. Both of you, for as long as you want. Cody cleared his throat pointedly, reminding them they weren't alone. Well, now that's settled, I should probably make my way back to town. Got a room waiting at the boarding house. Nonsense, Bryce said, rising from the cot. It's nearly dark and you're injured. You'll stay here for the night. I can take the floor. And where will Mrs. Miller sleep? Cody asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. The cot is big enough for her and Benjamin, Bryce replied, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. Zara, touched by Bryce's concern for his friend and his continued respect for her reputation, smiled reassuringly. We'll be fine, Cody. Please stay. It's the least we can do after you risked yourself to help us. With that settled, they passed the evening in surprisingly comfortable companionship. Bryce prepared a simple meal from the supplies in the line shack, while Zara tended to Benjamin, and Cody regaled them with stories of his adventures as a cavalry scout, before settling in Nevada territory. As night deepened and Benjamin slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden box, Zara found herself watching Bryce covertly. The firelight cast his features in warm gold, softening the lines of concentration that often marked his brow. He laughed at something Cody said, the sound rich and genuine, and Zara realized with a start that she wanted to hear that laugh every day for the rest of her life. The thought should have frightened her. She was a widow of less than a year, after all, with a newborn son to consider. But instead, it felt like the most natural conclusion in the world. Bryce Xavier, with his quiet strength and unassuming kindness, had carved out a place in her heart when she least expected it. Morning brought clear skies and a decision to return to the cabin. Cody, insisting his ribs were merely bruised and not broken, joined them for the journey back, his presence a welcome additional security should Hollister have been foolish enough to return. The cabin, when they arrived, showed signs of the previous day's confrontation, furniture overturned, Zara's few possessions scattered, Buck's food bowl kicked across the floor. But the dog himself greeted them joyously, having apparently hidden during the worst of the altercation and emerged unscathed once the intruders had gone. It's not so bad, Bryce assessed, surveying the damage. We can have it set to rights by evening. And so they did, working together with the easy rhythm that had developed between them over the weeks of shared living. Cody pitched in despite his sore ribs, and by the time the sun began its descent, the cabin looked much as it had before Hollister's invasion, perhaps even better, as the thorough cleaning had reached corners long neglected. Cody departed after an early supper, declining Bryce's offer to stay another night with the explanation that he had business to attend to in town, though the knowing look he gave Bryce suggested his reasons for leaving might have more to do with giving the pair privacy than any pressing appointments. After he'd gone, a comfortable silence settled over the cabin. Benjamin, exhausted by the excitement of the day, had fallen asleep in his cradle. Buck lay sprawled before the fire, his occasional twitches suggesting he was chasing rabbits in his dreams. Zara sat at the table, mending one of Bryce's shirts that had been torn in the scuffle with Hollister's men. Bryce himself stood by the window, looking out at the darkening landscape, his expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" Zara asked, setting aside her mending. Bryce turned from the window, his gaze finding hers in the soft lamplight. "About how quickly everything can change. Yesterday morning, I rode out thinking the biggest challenge of my day would be negotiating grazing rights. By nightfall, I'd nearly lost." He hesitated, then finished more quietly. "Everything that matters." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Zara rose from the table and moved to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body but not quite touching. "When I ran from Hollister," she said softly, "I thought I was just trying to survive, to protect Benjamin I never imagined I'd find." She paused, searching for the right words. A home, someone who would risk himself to keep us safe. Bryce turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't risk, it was necessity, the thought of harm coming to you or Benjamin." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I've grown accustomed to having you here, Zara, more than accustomed, the idea of you leaving." "I'm not leaving," Zara assured him, daring to place her hand on his arm. "Not unless you ask me to." "I'll never ask that," Bryce replied, his voice rough with emotion. "But I need you to know something. I don't expect anything from you. You and Benjamin are welcome here for as long as you want without obligation. Your friendship alone is more than I dared hope for when I found you in that snowstorm." Zara studied his face, reading the sincerity there, the carefully restrained longing. "And if I wanted more than friendship?" she asked, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. Bryce went very still, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Zara," he said, her name a whispered prayer on his lips. "You don't have to offer that, not out of gratitude or obligation." "Not gratitude," she corrected gently. "And certainly not obligation. I've had months to observe the kind of man you are, Bryce Xavier. You're honorable, kind, patient. You've shown more care for Benjamin than his own father had the chance to." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm not saying I'm ready for promises or vows. It's too soon for that. But I am saying I'd like the chance to see where this might lead, if you would." For a moment, Bryce simply looked at her, as if memorizing every detail of her face in that moment. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he raised his hand to cup her cheek, his touch as gentle as if she were made of the finest porcelain. "I would like nothing more," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "For as long as you'll have me, I'm yours." Zara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the simple pleasure of it. When she opened them again, Bryce was watching her with such tenderness that it nearly took her breath away. "May I kiss you?" he asked, the formal request so quintessentially Bryce that it brought a smile to her lips. "Yes," she whispered, already rising onto her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as they both relaxed into the rightness of it. Bryce's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while Zara's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of sensation. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted with a small, sheepish smile. "Why didn't you?" Zara asked, genuinely curious. "Didn't want to presume. You've been through so much, lost so much. The last thing you needed was some love-struck fool pushing his attentions on you." "Love-struck?" Zara repeated, warmth blooming in her chest at the implication. Bryce's cheeks reddened, but he didn't look away. "Too soon to say that." "No," Zara assured him, rising to press another quick kiss to his lips. "Not too soon at all." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Zara's life. Spring settled fully over the land, bringing with it new calves, wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in riots of color, and a sense of renewal that matched the growing relationship between her and Bryce. They took things slowly, neither wanting to rush what was developing between them. Bryce continued to sleep on the pallet by the fire, though their good nights now included lingering kisses and whispered words of affection. During the day, they worked side by side, Zara learning the rhythms of ranch life while Bryce discovered the joys of watching Benjamin grow and develop day by day. Word of Hollister's humiliation spread quickly through the territory, aided no doubt by Sullivan's first-hand account. Far from facing censure for harboring Zara, Bryce found himself the recipient of quiet approval from neighboring ranchers, many of whom had long resented the mine owner's tactics, but lacked the courage to stand against him directly. As March gave way to April, and then May, Zara's confidence grew, both in her feelings for Bryce and in her ability to contribute meaningfully to their shared home. She planted a vegetable garden behind the cabin, using seeds Bryce had ordered from a catalog but never gotten around to planting himself. She learned to milk the 2 cows Bryce kept for dairy, to collect eggs from the small flock of chickens that roamed the yard, and even under Bryce's patient tutelage, to ride horseback with growing skill. Benjamin thrived in the clean air and peaceful surroundings, growing plump and strong. His eyes, which had been the dark blue of all newborns, settled into a shade of green that reminded Zara of Michael, a bittersweet reminder of the man who had given her this precious gift before his untimely death. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, Benjamin sleeping contentedly in Bryce's arms, Zara found herself contemplating how dramatically her life had changed in the span of 6 months. "What are you thinking?" Bryce asked, noticing her pensive expression. "About fate," Zara replied honestly. "If I hadn't fled Tanapa that day, if you hadn't been returning from town at exactly that moment, if the snow hadn't forced me to stop where I did, so many things had to align perfectly for us to find each other." Bryce nodded thoughtfully. "My mother used to say that God never closes a door without opening a window. Maybe all those hardships were just leading us to each other." "A romantic notion," Zara observed with a smile. "I wouldn't have expected that from a practical man like yourself." "You bring out unexpected sides of me," Bryce admitted, shifting Benjamin to a more comfortable position in his arms. The ease with which he handled the baby, now nearly 5 months old, never failed to warm Zara's heart. "Besides, how else do you explain it? The odds against our meeting as we did must be astronomical." "Yet here we are," Zara murmured, reaching out to cover his free hand with her own. "Here we are," Bryce agreed, turning his hand to intertwine their fingers. After a moment of companionable silence, he cleared his throat, a sign Zara had come to recognize as preceding something he found difficult to say. "I've been thinking." "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. Bryce's lips quirked in a brief smile before his expression turned serious again. "Benjamin is growing so fast. Soon he'll be too big for that cradle. He'll need a proper bed." "I've been thinking the same," Zara acknowledged. "Perhaps we could look for one next time we go to Carson City, or I could build one," Bryce suggested. "With a matching one beside it for when the next child comes along." Zara's breath caught at the implication. The next child. Bryce met her gaze steadily, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the vulnerability in his eyes. "If you'd want that. With me." Understanding dawned, and with it, a surge of emotion so powerful that tears sprang to Zara's eyes. "Bryce Xavier, are you proposing to me?" "Not very well, it seems," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. Then, with careful movements to avoid disturbing Benjamin, he shifted to face her more directly. "I love you, Zara. I love Benjamin as if he were my own. I want to build a life with both of you, a real life as husband and wife, as a family. If you'll have me." The simple, heartfelt words touched Zara deeply. There was no grand gesture, no flowery speech, just the honest declaration of a man who had proven his love through actions long before putting it into words. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll have you." The joy that bloomed on Bryce's face was like the sunrise, gradual but transformative, lighting his features from within. "You're sure?" "I know it hasn't been that long since Michael." Zara placed her fingers gently against his lips, stilling the concern. "Michael will always be a part of me, a part of Benjamin, but loving you doesn't diminish that, it honors it. He would want Benjamin to have a father who loves him and me to have a husband who cherishes me." She smiled through her tears. "As you do." Bryce kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and future and home. When they parted, Benjamin stirred between them, his tiny face scrunching in momentary displeasure before settling back to sleep, one small hand curled trustingly around Bryce's finger. "Look at that," Bryce whispered, awe in his voice. "He's already holding on." "Just like his mother," Zara replied softly. "We know a good thing when we find it." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Carson City, with Cody standing as Bryce's best man and the preacher's wife holding Benjamin. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, attended by a small gathering of ranchers and townspeople who had come to know and respect the couple. As summer bloomed across the land, so too did their happiness. Bryce, true to his word, built not one but 2 small beds, placing them in what had once been the storage loft but was now a cozy nursery. Benjamin graduated from cradle to bed with the solemn ceremony such milestones deserved. And if the second bed remained empty for the time being, both Bryce and Zara were content in the knowledge that, God willing, it would not remain so forever. Their first wedding anniversary found them sitting once again on the porch, but this time Benjamin was not a sleeping infant but a toddling 1-year-old, determinedly exploring the yard under the watchful eye of an aging but still vigilant buck. And this time, it was Zara who had news to share. "I've been to see Dr. Wilson in Carson City," she told Bryce, her eyes shining with suppressed excitement. Bryce immediately looked concerned. "Are you unwell? Why didn't you tell me you needed to see the doctor?" "Because I wanted to be sure before I said anything," Zara replied, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "We're going to need that second bed sooner than we thought." Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "You're with child, our child." "Our child," Zara confirmed, laughing as Bryce gathered her into an embrace so enthusiastic it lifted her feet off the ground. Due in early spring, according to the doctor. Early spring, Bryce repeated, setting her down gently but keeping his arms around her waist. Almost exactly 2 years since I found you in that snowstorm. A fitting symmetry, don't you think? Zara asked, wrapping her arms around his neck. From ending to beginning, from despair to hope, from strangers to family, Bryce added, his voice thick with emotion. I love you, Zara Xavier. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Zara replied, rising on tiptoes to press her lips to his. My unexpected salvation, my home. As the sun set over the Nevada landscape, painting the sky in the same shades of crimson and gold that had colored the day they met, Bryce and Zara Xavier stood entwined on their porch, watching their son play in the yard of the home they had built together, not just the physical structure of wood and stone, but the deeper home of shared dreams, mutual respect, and enduring love. And when their daughter, Sarah, was born the following March during a gentle spring snow, Bryce placed her in Zara's arms with the same tenderness he had shown Benjamin on that fateful night 2 years earlier. But this time, instead of uncertainty and caution between them, there was only the deep, abiding certainty of a love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings, a pregnant woman fleeing through snow, a cowboy offering his strength, and the journey that had brought them home to each other.